He became pregnant his sister as a teenager, a sentence that echoes the dark mountains of Tennessee, carrying decades of silence and shame. This is the history of the Sullivan family, whose roots intertwined in prohibited ways in the depths of the Appalachians, resulting in consequences that transcended whole generations. The year was 1967. While America became freedom movements and the Vietnam War dominated the headlines, a completely different world existed in the isolated mountains of eastern Tennessee. In a remote community known as Valley of Shadows, the Sullivan family lived virtually disconnected from modern society. Thomas Sullivan, the 48-year-old patriarch, had built a life away from public scrutiny. With his deceased wife 5 years ago, he raised his 4 children alone in a rudimentary cabin. Elijah, the oldest, 19, Margaret, 16, Sarah, 13, and the youngest, Timothy, just 9 years old. For the local community, the Sullivan represented only another poor imprisonment family, fighting for survival between the difficulties of mountain life. The isolation was not accidental. For 3 generations, the Sullivan had deliberately away from the outside world. Thomas's father was a cousin of his own mother, and Thomas had married a second-degree cousin. This pattern of relationships was not completely uncommon in the most isolated communities of the Appalachians of that time. The first signs that something disturbing occurred at Casa dos Sullivan emerged when Margaret, at 16, began to miss class at the small school. Professor Mary Whitfield, one of the few people who kept regular contact with the family, noticed the prolonged absence of the teenager. Margaret has always been a quiet but intelligent girl, Mary later reported in her statement. When she stopped coming to school and her brother Elijah began to make increasingly elaborate excuses, I felt something was wrong. What Mary couldn't imagine was the dimension of the horror that unfolded in that cabin. Elijah Sullivan, the older brother, had developed an inappropriate relationship with his sister Margaret. Taking advantage of the absence of his father, who was often absent for days to work on neighboring farms, Elijah had begun a dominant situation about his sister, who eventually resulted in a pregnancy. I realized that Margaret was wearing increasingly wide clothes even on hot days, Sarah, her younger sister, later recalled. Elijah forbade us to talk about it. He said Margaret was sick and everything was a family matter. The dynamics of the Sullivan family was characterized by control and fear. After his mother's death, Elijah had assumed a position of disproportionate authority. Thomas, consumed by work and mourning, did not realize how his eldest son had turned the family hierarchy. The situation reached a critical point when Mary Whitfield, the worried teacher, decided to visit the Sullivan cabana after almost 4 months without seeing Margaret. What she found would forever change the fate of that family. It was a rainy afternoon of October when Mary traveled the muddy road to the isolated property of the Sullivan. Upon arrival, he found Margaret alone, visibly pregnant and in a state of profound emotional suffering. She was sitting in the basement of the house, looking like a completely different person. Mary reported in her later statement to social assistants, "When you saw me, it started to cry in a way I will never forget." It was at that moment that the first layer of Sullivan's secret began to disprove itself, revealing a behavioral pattern that extended for generations but had never been confronted so directly. Check it out if it is already subscribed to this channel. If you value real stories that expose hidden truths of American society, you cannot lose our next episodes. Each inscription helps us continue revealing these forgotten stories that, as painful as they may be, need to be told to understand our own story. Mary Whitfield's visit to the Sullivan cabana triggered a series of events that would bring decades of family secrets. After finding Margaret in an advanced state of pregnancy, the teacher called the local authorities. Sheriff John Caldwell, a 54-year-old man who had spent his entire life in the county, was the one who answered the call. Arriving at the Sullivan property the next day, he found a scene that, even after 30 years of police work, would disturb him for the rest of his life. "I entered that cabin and immediately realized that something was deeply wrong," Caldwell reported in her 1967 official records. The girl was clearly pregnant, her older brother seemed threatening, and her father simply avoided looking at any of them. During the initial interrogation, The family tried to support the story that Margaret had been involved with a boy from another community that had left to fight in Vietnam. But Sarah, the 13-year-old sister, eventually revealed the truth to the sheriff when she questioned her separately. "Elijah said we were special," were the words of Sarah, recorded in the police report. "He said that in the mountains, old families like ours had different rules from the people in the city." What followed was an investigation that revealed not only the improper relationship between Elijah and Margaret, but a disturbing generational pattern. The Sullivan family records, when finally examined, showed a lineage marked by unions between nearby cousins by at least 4 generations. The case gained the attention of Dr. William Thornton, a doctor of the small local clinic who had studied at Johns Hopkins University. Thornton immediately recognized the physical signs of prolonged consanguinity in the family. Timothy, the youngest, had significant learning difficulties and an atypical cranial conformation, noted Dr. Thornton in his medical report. Sarah demonstrated severe vision problems and impaired motor development. These are classic signs of a high degree of consanguinity lineage. Elijah Sullivan was arrested and formally accused, but the 1967 judiciary, in a rural and conservative Tennessee, was poorly equipped to deal with such a complex case. Authorities would discuss whether they would treat him as a conventional crime or as the result of isolated cultural practices that demanded a different approach. During the weeks that followed, local social services, extremely limited at the time, tried to support Margaret. The 16-year-old was now in the 7th month of pregnancy, confused and traumatized. She didn't fully understand what had happened to her, explained Elizabeth Morrows, the social worker designated for the case. Margaret grew up in a separate world, where the normal rules of society did not apply. The history of the Sullivan began to spread across the region, first as whispers, and then as a case of disturbing study of what could happen in isolated communities. For locals, the situation caused a mixture of horror and reluctant recognition that there were mountain families who lived according to their own rules. The investigation revealed even more disturbing details about family dynamics. Thomas Sullivan, his father, had grown under similar conditions. His own father had married a nearby cousin, and geographical and social isolation had been a deliberate strategy for generations. The parish records of the small local church, dated from the 1910s, already mentioned concerns about the families of the mountains that refused to mix. A pastor of that time had tried to intervene, but found fierce resistance and eventually gave up. But it was Margaret's health that most worried doctors now involved in the case. At 6 months of pregnancy, she had alarming signs. Blood pressure was dangerously high, and initial examinations suggested that the fetus could have serious malformations. A pregnancy resulting from close consanguinity, as it carries significantly increased risks, Dr. Thornton explained in medical records. The harmful recessive genes, which would usually remain numb in a diverse population, are much more likely to speak when close relatives have children. Knoxville University Hospital, with its lighted corridors and teams of doctors in white coats, represented a completely strange world for Margaret Sullivan. The 16-year-old, who had spent all her life in the shadows of the mountains, was now under fluorescent lights, surrounded by machines whose purpose she barely understood. Dr. Richard Coleman, a high-risk obstetrics specialist, assumed the case after Margaret's transfer. His first meeting with the teenager was recorded in his memory and later in his medical records. The patient had clear signs of chronic malnutrition and lack of basic prenatal care, noted Dr. Coleman. In addition, I observed subtle but distinctive facial characteristics that suggested that it was already the product of some degree of consanguinity. The initial exams confirmed the concerns of local doctors. Margaret's pregnancy, the result of the union with his biological brother, had multiple complications. Ultrasound, a relatively new technology in 1967, revealed that the fetus had abnormal brain development and possible heart malformations. When we performed the first ultrasound, the whole team was silent, recalled years later nurse Janet Wilkins. It was an image, but that none of us were prepared to see. While doctors debated the course of action, Margaret's health was continued to deteriorate. She developed preeclampsia, a dangerous condition characterized by high blood pressure. The medical team was forced to induce birth prematurely when Margaret was about 32 weeks of gestation. Birth occurred on a timely night of November 1967. The baby, a boy, came into the world with multiple congenital conditions, including microcephaly, cardiac defects, and pronounced facial deformities. He was immediately placed in neonatal intensive care, while Margaret was fighting for his own life. The baby, temporarily recorded as Men's Sullivan baby, lived only 72 hours. Their organs, committed by multiple malformations, were unable to support basic vital functions. Margaret, sedated for much of that time, never saw her son. The death of the Sullivan baby was not only a personal tragedy, but also a case study that would later be documented in medical literature on the genetic risks of nearby consanguinity. Dr. Coleman, with judicial authorization, collected samples for genetic studies that would reveal alarming patterns of homozygosity. While the Sullivan baby became a study case, Margaret faced his own physical and psychological recovery process. The young woman now had to process not only physical trauma, but also the gradual understanding of the nature of her relationship with her brother and family practices that had been normalized in her environment. She was repeatedly asked about her family, especially about Sarah and Timothy, said psychologist Dr. Marianne Lewis, designated for her case. Margaret did not show the conventional understanding that what had happened was wrong. For her, it was simply the world she knew. Meanwhile, the judicial case against Elijah Sullivan continued. District Prosecutor Richard Bennett faced the challenge of suing a case that, although clearly criminal by the standards of the wider society, was rooted in isolated cultural practices. In court, Sarah Sullivan, then 14, was called to witness. His testimony, protected from the press due to his age, was described by those present as deeply disturbing. She detailed how Elijah had gradually assumed family control after her mother's death. Elijah always said that the outside world wanted to destroy our family, said Sarah's testimony. He said that our ancestors had moved away from the valley to preserve our blood, and that it was our responsibility to continue what they had started. I want you to say in the comments, the truth needs to be exposed, even when painful. This message represents our collective commitment to the revelation of stories that, however difficult, help us to understand the complexity of the human condition. When the fall of 1968 painted the mountains of Tennessee with shades of red and gold, the Valley of the Shadows looked the same as usual for the detached eyes. But for those who knew their recent history, something fundamental had changed. The Sullivan cabin remained in the same place, but it was empty, its darkened windows like closed eyes. Elijah Sullivan had been sentenced to 15 years in prison, a sentence considered severe at the time. Judge Arthur Blackwood, when he gave the sentence, had made it clear that the case represented a line that could not be crossed, even in the most isolated communities. Traditions have their place in society, said Judge Blackwood. But when cultural practices result in evident damage to vulnerable members of the family, the law must intervene. Thomas Sullivan, the patriarch, faced his own judgment for neglect and passive complicity. Although he received a suspended sentence due to the psychological evaluation that identified limited cognitive capacity, herself possibly the result of generations of consanguinity, he permanently lost the custody of his minor children. For Sarah and Timothy, the younger brothers, a new phase of life began. Initially placed in temporary homes, they were eventually welcomed by adoptive families. The adaptation process was particularly challenging for Timothy, whose cognitive limitations required specialized care. Timothy had not only intellectual challenges, but also profound confusion about basic social norms, explained his adoptive mother, Ruth Campbell, in later interviews. It had grown in an environment where family limits were distorted to the point of being unrecognizable. For Sarah, the transition was different, but equally complex. Intellectually insightful, she fought with conflicting feelings of family loyalty and grows understanding the abnormal character of its creation. I loved my family, Sarah confided to her therapist. But as I started living with the foster and attending a normal school, I realized that what happened in our cabin was not as other families lived. Margaret, in the meantime, faced his own recovery and rediscovered process. After months in a specialized institution, It was gradually introduced to a semi-independent life program. In 1970, at the age of 19, she had developed basic skills to work in the wider society, although emotional trauma remained deeply rooted. Margaret has made remarkable progress considering his starting point, said Dr. Lewis in his final report. She learned to read more fluently, developed basic social skills, and began to form a healthier understanding of appropriate relationships. One of the most lasting consequences of the Sullivan case was its impact on the medical and scientific understanding of consanguinity. The genetic samples collected from the deceased baby and subsequent studies of the family lineage became a reference material in research on the effects of unions between close relatives. Dr. Norwood, continuing his work on population genetics, identified what he called the Sullivan effect, the exponential increase in genetic risks when a lineage already committed by generations of consanguinity experiences sibling unions. The Sullivan case has allowed us to document how risks accumulate throughout generations, Norwood explained in a lecture at Johns Hopkins University in 1973. Each generation of relatives increases homozygosity, the presence of identical genes inherited from both parents. Sullivan case studies have significantly contributed to the development of genetic counseling as a medical discipline. As the 1970s advanced, doctors began to apply these lessons not only to isolated communities, but also to populations with a high rate of consanguineous marriages around the world. In 1975, almost 8 years after the initial events, a university documentary film team visited the region to produce an educational film about isolated communities from Appalachians. Although it did not mention the Sullivan by the name, the documentary Mountain Shadows addressed issues of isolation, poverty, and marriage practices in remote communities. One of the most impactful moments of the documentary was an anonymous interview with a young woman that the informed viewers recognized as Sarah Sullivan, then 21 years old. With his face obscured and altered voice to protect her identity, she offered a unique perspective. "Outside people see only the horror of the situation," she said in the documentary. And yes, it was horrible, but it was also our daily reality. We grew up believing that the outside world was dangerous and that only our family was safe. The 1990 winter arrived early on the Tennessee mountains, covering the peaks with a white cloak in November. In the small town of Cedar Ridge, approximately 70 kilometers from the old Valley of the Shadows, nurse Sarah Morris, formerly Sullivan, watched the snow through the window of her small home. At 36, Sarah had built a life that few could have predicted. Graduated in nursing, specializing in rural health, she had married David Morris, a local teacher, and adopted a girl, having not opted to have biological children, a conscious decision based on her family history. "Before we got married, I told David everything about my family," Sarah said in a personal diary later donated to the University of Tennessee. "I explained the genetic risks I could carry and my fear of passing on any hereditary predisposition." One December morning of that year, Sarah received a letter that would reopen chapters of her life that she had worked hard to reconcile. The letter came from Elijah, his brother, who had been released from prison 3 years before after he served 15 years from his original sentence. "Dear Sarah," the letter starts, "I know I probably don't want to hear from me, and I understand if you throw this card out without reading. But if you're reading this, I want you to know that I spent the last 20 years trying to understand what I did and why I did it." For Sarah, the letter represented a collision between her carefully compartmentalized past and the life she had built. For years, she had balanced two identities: Sarah Morris, the respected community nurse, and Sarah Sullivan, the survivor of a family marked by practices that society considered abominable. After days of deliberation, Sarah decided to respond to Elijah's letter, starting a cautious correspondence that would eventually lead to a supervised meeting in 1991. "If I Reunite," facilitated by a specialized family therapist, marked a significant moment not only for the Sullivan brothers, but also for professionals who had accompanied the case over decades. Margaret Sullivan had followed a different way. After years of support programs, she had found stability working in the kitchen of a hospital in Knoxville. Refusing to change her last name and maintaining a consciously limited connection with her past, she had developed a quiet but functional life. In 1992, when academic interest in the Sullivan case resurfaced on the 25th anniversary of the original events, Margaret surprised many by agreeing to participate in an interview for a resilience study in trauma survivors. "People always ask if I hate my brother or father," she said in the interview. "The truth is more complicated. How can I completely hate people who, in their own distorted way, believed they were following the rules of the only world they knew? But also, how can I feel angry at what was taken to me? Both things are true at the same time." Timothy Sullivan, the youngest member of the original family, continued to live in a support facility. His cognitive and physical problems, possibly resulting from generations of consanguinity, had limited his options. But within a structured environment, he had found a measure of satisfaction. The scientific and medical impact of the Sullivan case continued to evolve with the advancement of genetics. In the 1990s, with the development of the most sophisticated human genome project of genetic analysis, researchers revisited preserved samples and case data. In 1995, the Tennessee Health Department established the Mountain Health Program, an initiative designed to provide health education and medical services to isolated rural communities. Although never explicitly mentioned, the program had been widely inspired by the lessons learned from the Sullivan case. The old Sullivan cabin, abandoned for decades, finally collapsed during a winter storm in 1997, symbolically marking the end of an era. In the place where once there was an isolated and dysfunctional family, the forest had claimed its territory. In 2000, 33 years after the original events, the University of Tennessee established the Center for Rural Studies Sullivan, dedicated to research on geographical isolation, cultural practices in remote communities, and appropriate interventions for vulnerable populations. "We can't change what happened," Sarah said at the inauguration ceremony, publicly talking about her history for the first time. "But we can guarantee that the suffering of our family was not in vain, that the lessons learned will continue to protect other vulnerable families for generations. People want simple stories," Margaret noted in his last known interview in 2002. "They want monsters and victims, villains and heroes. But the truth is almost never so simple. Our family was created by generations of isolation, ignorance and fear. What happened to us was terrible, but it was also the result of larger forces than any individual. If you watched so far, it is because you liked this story. Leave a comment saying, 'I watched here so I can meet you and know who really likes the stories here on the channel.' Be sure to subscribe to the channel to follow more stories like this that reveal the dark secrets of American families. Your support is critical so that we can continue bringing these important stories that, however painful, need to be told. If this story has played you in any way, please leave your like and share with people who also appreciate educational content about historical cases. The truth needs to be exposed even when painful.